links higher rates of crimes to states' rights to carry a firearm. Joining me now to elaborate on the study's findings is president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, crimeresearch.org, John Lott. John, good to see you.
Hi.
So this is, this doesn't surprise you. You've covered this for quite some time. I'm not surprised by this, but it is nice to see that there is at least some more research to be able to push back against some of this. That they always say, oh, look at these states, the states that have that allow for concealed carry. Oh, they have such high rates of crime, etc. But it's actually the opposite that's true. I mean, I don't know how that argument can be made in the face of fact.
Personally, I don't think much of this study. I mean, the vast majority of academic studies have found, in fact, that allowing permanently concealed handguns reduces violent crime. I don't know any peer-reviewed published study that shows that there's an increase in, at least among economists and criminologists, that there's an increase in murder or rape or aggravated assault. There's one study in a public health journal that claims that there's an increase in homicide, but it's basically a complete mess. I mean, they don't even get the statistics right on that. Even if you accept how they set it up, if they calculated the statistical significance correctly, they don't get a statistically significant result. So, I'm not sure what to put about this one study that claims that there's no effect. Most of the studies find a benefit. In this case, again, it's a public health type study. It's not very well done.
Right.
You can't... See, here's the problem, in part. What they'll do is they'll go and use just a variable for whether the law is on or not. And you really have to look at the number of concealed carry permits. So, for example, if I'm looking at, let's say, the data over the last, 10 years, if I'm focusing on that, and I'll have Illinois giving concealed carry. But in Illinois, in order to get a permit, it costs $450. You're not going to have a very large percentage of the population going and getting a permit there, plus it's 16 hours of training. You've actually had a much bigger increase in the number of concealed carry permits in Texas, even though Texas has adopted its law back in 1996. The reason why you've had a bigger increase in permits in Texas is they've lowered the permit fee from $140 to $40. They've also reduced the training requirement from 10 hours to 4, plus changed the renewal training that was required. Those changes had a huge impact on the number of permits. You went from about 500,000 to about 1.2 million. And so, the issue, I would argue, is that the percentage of the population with permits is what matters. And, you can go and try to get proxies for that by looking at things like the fees for getting a permit, the training requirements, how many places you can go and carry your gun, whether, if there are lots of places you can't carry your concealed handgun, you're not going to have that many people who are going to go and bother to go and get a permit. But, the way this test would be set up, they'd be saying, well, Illinois passed its law back in 2013, and so you should see a big drop in crime in Illinois relative to Texas. Well, Texas had a much bigger increase in the number of concealed carry permits and the percentage of the adult population, more importantly, with permits. Plus, there's another factor there. It's just not the number of permits, but it's also who gets the permits. If my research shows that it's particularly important for the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime to be able to go and get a concealed carry permit, and that's overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. And when you have permits costing $450, have to get 16 hours of training, no facilities for training in Chicago, you can't go and take the guns on public transportation. So you're a poor person in Chicago who lives in a violent area there. You have to go and borrow somebody's car. You have to go and pay $450. We're not even talking about the price of the gun. We're just talking about the permitting fees and the training cost requirements, costs there. they're not the ones who are going to get permits. You'll have wealthy, well-to-do whites in the suburbs, which is fine, and there's a benefit from that. But they're not the ones who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, and they're not the ones who, if you increase their carrying, you're going to see the biggest change in crime rates from. So you have two factors there. One is the number of people carry in the mix, and when you have very high costs for getting a permit, you're going to have lower amounts in both of those categories. And so just saying, well, Illinois passed its law, in 2013, I should expect a drop in its crime rates relative to Texas, or some other state. Plus, you've had a lot of states recently that have gone to constitutional carry. And you may even have a state there that reduces the number of permits that are given out because not as many people, you don't need to go through the process. You can if you want to go and carry in other states. But, then you don't have any permit fee. You don't have any mandatory training requirement. My belief is that the number of people who are actually carrying has increased a lot. I mean, you can get some information from that just by looking at states like Idaho, where you see large increases in people asking for training. Even though it's no longer mandated that they have to go and get training, law-abiding citizens are concerned that they might do something wrong. And so a lot of people go and get training even when it's not mandated. So anyway, I saw the write-up at ILA for the NRA. There are other studies that come out that show a drop. I would have written an article about one of those, particularly ones that were better done. But, I'm not the one who wrote this story.
Here's a related question for you, because one of the things that you have on crimeresearch.org is you break things down state by state, and of course you go after and FISC. For the lack of a better way to put it, a lot of studies that have really bad methodology or don't release their data. Is there something comparable in terms of looking at defensive gun uses state by state, similar to the FBI uniform crime reports? And I know that gets tricky because of the way that they're tabulated state by state, and how in some instances maybe they're not even properly recorded. But is there something to that does log defensive gun uses state by state annually, similar to the UCRs?
The only way you can look at that would be from some type of survey. Most defensive gun uses, the overwhelming majority, I'd say something around 95% or so, simply involve brandishing. A lot of those aren't going to be reported to police.
And then a lot of times that's not even really taken into account by law enforcement because shots weren't fired and there are no injuries or fatalities.
Right, but first of all, the police don't record defensive gun uses in any systematic way. Maybe you might have a justifiable homicide. That might be the only case. But
right.
But what people don't realize, because you often hear, well, there's only 300 justifiable homicides in the year, and so that proves that people don't use guns defensively. That's just nutty. As I say, first of all, the vast majority of time you're not even firing the gun. People are maybe killed fewer than 1 out of every 1,000 times that people use a gun defensively. So you're only talking about a tiny fraction. But it's even worse than that, and that is the vast majority of police departments in the country don't even report justifiable homicide numbers. And even the ones that do report justifiable homicide numbers do a horrible job. Because what happens is that you may have a defensive gun use in 1 year, and it may take 2 or 3 years before it's adjudicated to determine whether or not somebody actually was justified in using it. But they don't go back and fix the earlier report to record it then as a justifiable homicide. And so there have been, people have looked at this, and even the, few percent of police departments that even bother report justifiable homicides. So you may hear that 35 states report justifiable homicides. So we have 15 that don't report anything. But even the 35 that do, it may only be a few jurisdictions in their state that are reporting it. And so it's a completely meaningless number that you have there. That, and the gun control advocates like to point to it all the time. If it were me, and I was in the Trump administration, one of the things I would do is, it used to be 20 years ago, you get the old paper copies of the FBI uniform crime reports. They'd have an asterisk next to it saying, this is based on incomplete reporting, not to be used for any type of statistical analysis. And I'd make sure that was all over the place so people understood that there are real problems with it. But that would be about the closest thing to answering your question, and there's nothing else that's like that. I mean, the only thing I think you can really do is to see relationships between the percentage of the population that's carrying and changes in crime rates. But of course, then you have two things that are going on. One, you may have some defensive gun uses, but two, you may have deterrence. The fact that some people might defend themselves can also cause some criminals not to attack anybody to begin with.
Yeah, that would make sense too, because if they know that more individuals are carrying, they're going to be less kind of like the Florida model. They're going to be less likely to engage in criminal activity. Very interesting, because that's something that's so often discussed. And I see that the reason I brought it up with you before I let you go, John, the reason I brought it up with you is because that is the most often thing that I see discussed amongst gun owners everywhere on social media. I see it, and people discuss it everywhere. And even, in instances on cable news, individuals kind of go back and forth and have those questions. So interesting. You think that we would put more effort behind making sure that those numbers are accurate. I hope the administration takes your advice on that. John Lott, always a pleasure, John.
Sure. I mean, there are things that they can do. But anyway, thanks for having me on.
Good to talk with you, as always.